Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. The talk of Christian nationalism is everywhere these days, and my guest today wonders if we might want to stop using the term. In March, Princeton professor Heath Carter penned a piece in The Atlantic with the provocative title, Americans Should Stop Using the Term Christian Nationalism. And while Christian nationalism is real, in this discussion, we talk really about the overuse of the term and how to have a discussion across political divides. Before we go into today's podcast, a little bit about Heath. He is an associate professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, where he teaches and writes about the intersection of Christianity and public life. He is the author of Union Made, Working People and the Rise of Social Christianity in Chicago, which came out in 2015. It was a runner-up for the American Society of Church History's 2015 Brewer Prize. He's currently working on a new book, and the title of that book is On Earth as It Is in Heaven, Social Christians and the Fight to End Inequality. And that retells the story of the American social gospel. And spoiler alert, we kind of do talk a little bit about the social gospel in this discussion, kind of its connection with the term Christian nationalism. So if you're curious and see where those connections are, keep listening. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Heath Carter. Well, Heath, thanks for joining me today. I wanted to start to know a little bit about you, including your faith background.
Sure. I grew up in, it's great to be on, by the way. Thanks so much for having me. I grew up in the Midwest and then in California in evangelical churches, I think in the Midwest and in Kansas, and kind of smaller Baptist-ish churches. And then we moved to Southern California and joined a church that was huge by our Kansas standards at the time, but that was small by its future standards, which was Rick Warren's Saddleback. That was 1990. So it was
Okay.
2,000 people meeting at a high school at that point. I went to a Jesuit university and studied theology there, and that really had a profound impact on my faith. I grew up in kind of the wilds of American evangelicalism, I like to say. It wasn't like the intellectual beating heart of like a Wheaton or a Calvin or anything like that. It was really like kind of the more fundamentalist, more moral majority, some would say these days Christian nationalist sorts of evangelical worlds of the 80s and 90s. The Jesuits really opened up the kind of wider, deeper worlds of Christian faith and tradition to me. And I didn't become Catholic, but I've kind of been on a journey ever since. I worship now at a PCUSA church here in Princeton, where I work.
Okay. Well, you kind of led me into that with the mention of Christian nationalism, and we wanted to talk a little bit about your article in The Atlantic, which was basically kind of saying that maybe that term has been either a bit overused and that we should try to use it a little bit less. And I'm kind of curious, just as a basic start, what led you to write that article?
Yeah. Well, I think it's something that I've been thinking about for quite a while. Obviously, I'm an American religious historian, and this is the conversation in which my field has probably most broken out into kind of the public square in the last 10 years is around this term or this theme of Christian nationalism. I am, as worried as anybody is about the fact that someone like a Doug Wilson,
Mm-hmm.
is a kind of a theocrat, throwback reactionary Calvinist theocrat. I'm as concerned as anybody that he's got connections in the Pentagon. So it's not that I think we should be, of course, alarmed about the dangerous currents in our national life and in our Christian landscape today. Um, the challenge, in my view, there's multiple challenges. I mean, one is I think as a historian, I don't know that the current conversation about Christian nationalism captures the really remarkably deep and multifaceted ways that Christianity and nationalism have been interwoven in U.S. history, going all the way back to the founding, really, or at least the generation after the founding. Um, so I have a whole set of like kind of analytical questions about the like to what extent the term holds analytical water, but I also wonder about the ways that the term, sort of the political strategy, which I think is part of what the conversation is really concerned with, is like kind of the politics of right now. And I'm not sure that the term is doing the work that people in the worlds that I live in and that are part of this conversation hope it will. So I can talk more about this, but those two different kinds of concerns that I have about the current conversation.
What do you think is the because you just kind of said that you don't think the term is doing the work that people who are using it wanting to do. What is it that they want it to do?
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on who you talk to, and this is part of the problem with the term. I do think there are there's this is a term that has both there's a scholarly conversation around this term. It's especially vibrant, I think, in the world of sociology. I think the folks there really do want to kind of zero in on what they think is a discernible, distinctive, alarming phenomenon of especially white Christians who are, um, you know, uh, maybe opposed or at least not committed to a sort of pluralistic democracy. I think that's
Hmm.
what they, at some level are trying to pinpoint in the popular conversation. So this is, like I said, this is a term that has like broken out of the academy. A lot of times we have these academic conversations and nobody ever knows it because nobody reads the journals that we publish in or whatnot. But this conversation is broken out. And so, I mean, if you go on social media any given day and you search Christian nationalism, you'll see all kinds of non-academics using the term. And when you look there, I think the term there can mean almost anything. And I think if you ask 10 different people or 100 different people what the term means, you'd get a lot of different kinds of answers. I think for a lot of people, it just means like Christians who voted for Trump. And that's a complicated category that is a lot broader than, for example, Doug Wilson, who genuinely wants, Christian values to be privileged to the extent that in his hope, I mean, I listened to an interview with him where he talked about how for him, basically, God is angry at the United States and will not stop being angry at this country until we have totally marginalized people of other faiths or people who are not living in accordance with what he deems to be Christian values. That's a very distinctive, and there are other flavors and varieties of what you could call theocracy or dominionism or illiberal projects that do not affirm pluralistic democracy in any kind of way. And I think we should all be concerned about those. That is a smaller stream in US history, I think, than the stream of like, again, there's this much wider stream in which, Christianity and nationalism are interwoven, in which lots of different kinds of people have tried to work towards something that they thought would be a more Christian America. Lots of people have been a part of that project. So for me, if the term was working well, it would mean the first thing. It would mean like the people who are illiberal, who have rejected pluralism, pluralistic democracy, who are trying to, fight for various forms of theocracy or dominionism or whatnot. That could be helpful if the term was just talking about those people. But I think in the popular conversation, it often means it's used synonymously with evangelical. It's used synonymously with any Christian who voted for Trump, even if maybe they voted for Biden 4 years before that, and maybe they aren't actually, against pluralistic democracy, but for a variety of complicated reasons, pulled the lever for someone that I did not in this most recent election. So I'm worried about a term that's sort of lost its specificity and um, that's a concern. That concerns especially about the kind of politics and strategy of the term. A lot of times I get asked to go to different mainline churches, ecumenical Protestant churches these days. I get asked all the time by people in those predominantly white, mainline churches to come and talk to them about Christian nationalism. Again, so where is the piece coming from? Partly it's coming from my worry that those invitations reflect a desire for the folks in those churches who are dear folks who want to do the right thing, for me to come and tell them about how all the bad people are out there, and by implication that in some sense they're doing it right. And I think the thing that I worry about, I mean, one thing we know is more than 50% of white mainliners voted for Donald Trump the last three
Hmm.
elections. More than 50% of white Catholics voted for Donald Trump the last three elections. And I worry that this conversation, the way that it actually is playing out, allows folks who should feel on the hook for the current challenges and crises that we face to be off the hook in the conversation. That's like at a functional level, at least how I've interpreted some of those invitations. And so what I've tried to do, and what I try to do in that piece, what I've tried to do in my own speaking I speak at churches all the time, is not to deny that there are dangerous currents out there, so to speak, but also to say, this is also part of our story. We're part of the folks who have like gotten us to this place. And as much as we should be worried about folks out there, we also need to do introspection. We need to look in the mirror and look at the ways that these ecumenical Protestant mainline churches have played a part in the story of how we get here. Um, so yeah. Yeah, and I guess part of the let me just say one more thing. It's just that
Hmm.
part of the thrust of the piece is to say that, in some sense, the world of like the white mainline, predominantly white mainline, and never exclusively white, but it wielded tons of power in the middle of the 20th century. And by my measure, it was not a perfect thing. I'm not nostalgic for it in any way. But from the president's cabinet to the Congress to state houses across the country, I'm writing a book about that world and the ways that it fought for a more equal United States of America.
Hmm.
And it's curious to me, given the sort of shape of that project, which was an ambitious political project, that we don't talk about that world when we talk about kind of Christian America or Christian nationalism. Given the ambitions, given the extent to which folks, I think in that moment and also today that are left of center, want to legislate their morality. I think we can be honest that, and part of what I'm saying in the piece is then let's not make it about that. I think a lot of Americans, Christian and not, want to legislate their most deeply held values. Let's look at the values and let's argue about the values. I think there's a lot of values in the kind of MAGA Christian world that I, for one, find really deeply problematic and deeply unchristian. And
Hmm.
that's where the action can be at, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you begin that article in the Atlantic with a story of a meeting with the Federal Council of Churches, which was kind of the predecessor to the National Council of Churches. The kind of the body of a
Yeah.
lot of mainline Protestantism. And, what I think about also a lot is how much mainline Protestantism was involved in even things even before the Federal Council of Churches. I mean, you could look at abolition. That was also a place where there was a lot of, you could say, a version of Christian nationalism in that. Why do you think that history has been forgotten? And is that something that just people have just forgotten? Or is there a purposeful forgetting? I
Yeah.
mean, in that.
Well, I think, yeah, there's been a lot of work done in the last, I mean, so we live in the shadow of a generation that's been deeply formed by the religious right. And there's no
Hmm.
doubt about that. And a lot of the success of the religious right, which, if you were I talk about this all the time in my classes. I mean, if you were alive in 1973, the year that Roe is decided by the Supreme Court, in the wake of these kind of monumental civil rights breakthroughs in the 1960s, and if you're a conservative, you're kind of looking at the landscape, especially if you're a religious conservative, and saying like, we lost. They didn't give up, however, right? They at that point began, kind of the religious right is able to effectively like kind of out organize and deploy and build powerful partnerships, build a coalition with Catholics and evangelicals that had been unimaginable in earlier generations. Um, and they have so deeply shaped the kind of sense of what Christianity, like public faith, means, over the last generation, that I do think people have just forgotten. They've forgotten that in the generations before the religious right, you had a really powerful religious liberalism that had, kind of came, in my view, to its most like kind of important moment in the mid 20th century, when you get everything from the New Deal to the breakthroughs of kind of labor and civil rights movements and the Great Society. That is like the full flourishing. That sort of full flourishing built on earlier generations. You mentioned the 19th century, kind of the traditions of abolition and whatnot. These grassroots movements that emerged out of, in response to slavery and industrial capitalism. Faithful Christians on the ground who said, "Hey, I think the Bible has something to say about justice, and I'm a part of these movements." And over the course of generations, they built the power to, again, by the mid 20th century, deeply impact the kind of shape of the nation. It's a great question as to why we don't remember it. I mean, I think it is partly, it speaks to the effectiveness of the religious right at making a claim that their Christianity, their view, their version of Christianity is the only version. And, that's certainly just not right historically, but it can seem right these days, and I think for a lot of people, it seems like that's what's on offer in the public square is this thing. And it's between that and a, secular kind of option or something like that.
And what is the danger in kind of the confusion of how we're looking at Christian nationalism sometimes these days, that it could be just someone who voted for Donald Trump, and or thinking that Christian nationalism equals evangelical, because it seems that is something that a lot of people, at least what I hear sometimes, are doing. Is there a danger in that simplification in our,
For me, and this is like my view, right, would be
mhm,
that this is a time where like the liberal left coalition in this country needs to expand its ranks. And
mhm,
the thing that I worry about, I mean, frankly, with the way that this term, in some ways for me, like Christian nationalism, it's an interesting study in polarization, right? Because as I can tell, it seems like it's a term that people left of center lob at people right of center, who now increasingly take it up as a badge of honor, as people often do when they're insulted. They take up their insults as badges of honor. We see that happening. Um, and then other people feel resentful about having this insult lobbed at them. It's not clear to me. I mean, part of what I say in the piece is that it's changing people's minds to be called a Christian nationalist. And in some ways, I think it just, I worry that the stories that, I mean, I like I said, I grew up in these worlds, and I feel like I don't have to go searching for, quote unquote Christian nationalists. I mean, I have them in my family, people who I think have all kinds of problematic views about kind of the intersection of Christianity and public life. But I also know, like, part of my own commitment as somebody who grew up in that space and who's come to a different place in my life is I try to do what I can, and I think not everybody needs to do this, but I can do it, is to stay in touch with those folks and make it harder for them to hold on to those convictions.
mhm.
And I know that that doesn't start with me calling them names. It starts with me taking them seriously. And this to me is, I mean, I guess drives to the heart of my own experience, which is as somebody who grew up in a world like this, who showed up at a Jesuit university, a young evangelical Republican, and got paired with a lifelong Catholic who was the son of a Democratic congressman, was my roommate.
Mm.
And we argued about everything for all through college. And the thing that, I didn't change my mind in like one moment of that conversation, but I did change my mind over the course of many conversations because he took me seriously. And I think that's part of what I think for the liberal left coalition, you know, there are some people that are so far down a rabbit hole that, you know, you're never going to get them out, right? But I don't think everybody that voted for Donald Trump in the 2024 election is so far down a rabbit hole. In fact, we know some of them are already swinging back in a
Hmm.
way. And my thing is like I think the liberal left side of things needs to welcome those folks with open arms and build a tent that can take them back in and speak to them in a way that is curious about maybe why'd you do that thing in the past, but also is like, hey, let's build a better thing together over here. And for my purposes, like as I look at the way the Christian nationalism conversation is playing out, I don't see that. I see it moving people to dig deeper in, and I feel like it nurtures resentment, and I don't think it kind of promotes the kind of change that we need.
It seems in many ways, as you even said it earlier, that it's more of a tool for deeper polarization
Yeah.
than just kind of diagnosing a problem or diagnosing kind of part of our history.
Yeah. It to me, that is how it is mainly working. Again, if it was a really specific term that meant Doug Wilson and people like Doug Wilson who are actively seeking to overthrow pluralistic democracy, we need a term for that. And I think Matthew D. Taylor, who's a scholar who works on some of this stuff, he's written about hardline Christian extremism. And
Hmm.
something like that has real promise in my view because it's helpful in delineating like a really specific stream of really dangerous faith that hey, I don't think we need to be building bridges to that crowd, to be honest. I think we need to be calling it out, and I think we need to be shining a light on where they have been able to forge connections to powerful places. I think that's what needs to happen there. But we got to be able to make distinctions between that crowd and run of the mill folks who have been oscillating between the parties over the last generation. When, frankly, there really are a lot of people in this country who have not been doing well under either party. And I think,
Hmm.
they're looking for a way forward. Trump is in my view, not a responsible way to have transformation or change that we need. But people are frustrated, and people's actual conditions on the ground are actually deteriorating for a lot of people. And we got to be able to make distinctions between the Doug Wilsons who are plotting the overthrow of liberal democracy and folks on the ground who are struggling in their life and who are looking for change. And I don't think this conversation is doing that effectively right now.
I wonder if, and you may even talk, I think you briefly talk about this in the article. Does part of this have to deal with also kind of the changes that are going on with, I would say, the Democrats or progressives and how they view religion? I think you talked about maybe a few, well, there are a few things, a few examples. One, you talk about some of the rhetoric from Barack Obama about 20 years ago that when he talks about religion that just would seem somewhat out of place today. And I think the second thing that I personally noticed during the 2024 election um, is how the outreach was a little bit different. In the past, maybe even 20 years ago, there was a lot of trying to outreach, especially to evangelicals. And in the 2024 election with Kamala Harris, the person that was in charge of that was someone from a mainline background, and so there wasn't really as much of that outreach towards evangelicals. So, and I'm wondering if part of what we're seeing is also how the left maybe has started to move away from religion, or at least they're not as comfortable with
Yeah.
religion as they used to be.
Yeah. It's a real struggle for the Dems over the last generation. I mean, I think Obama had the ability, obviously, that beautiful speech he gave in Charleston after that heinous,
Hmm.
murder by Dylan Roof. He had a facility with kind of the language of faith and whatnot that the Dems had really struggled to produce before that, and have kind of struggled, I think, ever since. You know, I think again, and I sort of reference this in the piece, that the fact that the religious right has been so effective in casting itself as the real Christian witness in the public square. In some ways, I guess my worry is that the Dems have kind of let them have that lane and haven't tried to fight for that lane. And it's partly because I do think, the Democratic coalition is religiously plural, and it's obviously involves lots of folks who have no relationship to any kind of house of worship at all. And I think they don't want to alienate people, and they don't have the same sense of like our base. But the reality is, and I think this is really critical, right? There are actually a lot of people in the Democratic coalition for whom faith is really central. You think about all of the Black Christians who, are critical to the Democratic base, the growing numbers of Latino Catholics and evangelicals and Pentecostals who have got to be a part of the future of the Democratic coalition. You know, I think I understand maybe not deploying tons of resources to trying to convince white evangelicals to become Democrats, because their level of support for the Republican Party has really been quite resilient even through these last 10 years. But I think, the reality is for the Dems, the future of the party, I mean, got to find a way to compete in states that we used to be able to compete in and now don't. And, you know, states that are prairie states and Northwest states where there are significant numbers of religious voters for whom they feel alienated from the party. And I think I do genuinely think there are ways to thread the needle here and to say, hey, for a lot of folks, they come to our politics through faith. And to be able to talk about that in a way that's not a threat to pluralism or whatnot, but also that makes clear that the religious right, kind of MAGA aligned Christians, don't have the market cornered on faith in the public square. This has not been a strength of the party. I don't think they figured it out. We need probably standard bearers who have a kind of familiarity and fluency with the language of faith, not just at the presidential level, but kind of across the party. And again, I think urgently need to find candidates to run for, especially the Senate, in
Hmm.
places, parts of the country where faith remains a force on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think living as I do in the upper Midwest, I think one of the things that, and my husband grew up in North Dakota, and I think it wasn't that long ago that they had two Democratic senators,
That's
and
what I'm saying. Right.
um, now they don't. And I think that that's a problem.
It's a
It
huge
you
problem.
Yeah.
And it's not just North Dakota, right? It's North Dakota, South
No,
Dakota,
South
it's
Dakota.
West Virginia,
Hmm.
Montana, Ohio, Iowa. I mean, you can go down the line. There's so many states where even just 10 or 15 years ago, the Dems had one or two senators, and where we can't even run a competitive race in some of those places right now. And that is really deeply concerning given the structure of our federal government, that there are just huge parts of the geography of the country where now hopefully, I mean, this fall I'm hopeful that we got a competitive race in Ohio and Alaska, North Carolina, Maine. Maybe we can pull back in some of these states, but it can't just be a one-off because they've blown it so bad this year. It's got to be an ongoing ability to compete in places where the Democratic Party's brand has not been able to kind of translate into those places. And I think that's a tough assignment, but I also think it's a doable assignment and urgently needs to be taken up. And faith has got to be a part of it. I mean, I talked to some folks who were involved in a prairie election a few years ago, and they just said, we're not going to try to talk about faith because we're not comfortable. And I was like, you guys are just giving up on voters you need and voters you actually have the ability to talk to. And Democrats in the past have been able to do this. And some of the party's most kind of significant breakthroughs in American history have been through candidates who were able to talk about faith and the ways that democratic politics connect with a faith tradition.
That actually leads me to James Talarico,
Yeah.
and because he seems to be one of the most visible people out there who is talking about his faith, who is also a Democrat. What are your thoughts about him?
Yeah. I mean, I like Talarico. I mentioned him in that piece that, I think he's sometimes taken to criticizing Christian nationalists for building a political movement, which I don't think is the right vein of critique of them. I think we want him to build a political movement. So we're pro political movements. The critique is that the values that are at the core of that Christian nationalist, if you call it that, political movement are deeply problematic. I think Talarico is a really interesting example. I mean, there's others like him. I mean, I think Buttigieg has done a decent job of talking in a faith forward way. But Talarico has done it really well. Obviously, Texas is a place where faith really matters. And I think his ability to sort of effortlessly connect his own faith to a democratic political outlook is powerful. We'll see if it's enough, and obviously it probably depends on how that Republican primary plays out and who he ends up having to go against. It's going to be a tough race, and I think the Dems have often, in recent years, put a lot of hope in Texas, and it's kind of disappointed over and over again. But Talarico strikes me as doing something that is doable and that needs to be done more often. And it doesn't mean that every candidate needs to be like him, a Presbyterian seminarian or whatever, but we do need folks like him to have prominent roles in the party such that there can be a sense that, hey, there are folks right now who are able to connect their faith to a democratic political platform, and not all of us are going to do that, but this is a party where that's happening and where that can be done and where we welcome it and where people of deep faith and people of no faith are coming together to fight for in the best traditions of pluralistic democracy. And I think that's what the party needs, and it hasn't been able to put that faith forward thing quite out there as much as one wants, and Talarico is someone who's doing that well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting like first effort. I don't know if he necessarily matches what the average Texas voters is look or and Texas person of faith is all about, but it is at least a step forward, which I think in the last few years has not Democrats have not covered themselves in glory on that, and I
No.
think that that's been
Mhm.
to their detriment.
Yeah, I'm not persuaded that like Talarico is going to have some breakthrough victory. Look, but I think you know I think to your point earlier about people kind of forgetting that there could be a way as a person of deep faith to make a case for the kind of politics that Talarico stands for. This is part of the remembering, right? And I think he's gained not only an audience in Texas, but also across the country of folks who are hungry for these kinds of arguments to be made and to made prominently. And again, to put the sort of religious right back on its heels a little bit and have to make the case for what they do rather than being able to be the presumed voices of
Hmm.
Christianity in the public square. And I think the more that folks like Talarico and I think there are other Democrats who are capable of doing it, but it just hasn't been like our first, hasn't been at the fore in the ways that I think, if you look at the Congress, you look at the Democratic delegations in Congress, if you look at Democratic leaders across the country, there are a lot of Democrats who are people of faith. Um, but I do think at the party level, there's maybe been a kind of let's kind of keep that quiet because we don't want people to think that we're like them or something like that. There's this kind of squeamishness, and I think that's not serving us well. Because, like I said, there are a lot of voters who, across the Democratic coalition, for whom faith is absolutely critical, and we got to continue to connect with those people. And I think even if Talarico doesn't win this race, and I hope he will, but if he doesn't win the race, he may still have done a great good in terms of reminding Democratic voters and Democratic kind of elite party folks, like this is an important thing for us to be able to do.
So, how do you think people, or how do you think people should be talking about Christian nationalism,
Yeah,
let's say moving forward?
yeah,
As you have said, probably it's been really painting in some ways with too wide of a brush on people. But how do we talk about that to talk about it in a way that maybe includes a larger sense of who people are and maybe our nation's heritage, but at the same time also talk about maybe the more dangerous people that are out there, like Doug Wilson.
yeah, yeah. I think there's a way to just be, I mean, if you, I mean, one way to go is for people to use the term Christian nationalist to mean Doug Wilson and
Hmm.
folks like him, right? And to stop using it in this kind of blurry, vague, just those people over there that I don't like kind of way, which I think is the usage that's the usage that gives me the most concern at some level. I think there are other terms that, if it could catch on, like something like hardline Christian extremist is, it's not as catchy, maybe. It doesn't have the same, but it's clearer in my
It's
view.
yeah, I think it sounds a lot clearer.
It's a lot clearer, right? About what it is that we're worried about. And I think something like that could be really positive. I mean, I think again, for me, there's a way to say, hey, there are dangerous illiberal currents in the current religious and political landscape that need to be identified. Light needs to be shown on them, no question. And then we've got to find a way to kind of continue to make the case. I mean, there was a great book a few years ago by a guy, I interviewed him, Anand Giridharadas, called The Persuaders. And the whole point of the book, it was a book, he's a guy on the left. It was written to the left. And the argument of the book was, friends on the left, we have to redouble our commitment to persuasion, to making the case for our values. We don't have enough votes. We don't have enough. We need to kind of continue to build capacity behind the movements. If we want to change the world, the way you got to do that in a society like ours is you got to continue to make the case. And he's the one who, he says, like, there are people on both ends of the political spectrum who are never going to change their minds, but you'd be surprised about how many people will change their minds, and especially if you treat folks with dignity, generosity, curiosity. I mean, this is what I think, it's been interesting to watch someone like Zoran Mamdani in New York, who swept to victory in part by going to all these boroughs and neighborhoods where there were a lot of Trump voters, and he didn't sneer at them, and he didn't.
Mhm.
He went up and talked to him and was like, "Why'd you vote for that guy?" And then was like, "Let me tell you about what I'm about, and why I think I've got actually a more beautiful way forward for this city." That's the work, in my view. I mean, it's not the only thing we need to be doing, but it's part of the future. Is because this is the other thing, right? I think there are real dangers, and also, I mean, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of this country, and this is we're participating in a long-term project. This is a generational project, a democratic society that, I mean, there was Pew data a couple months ago that came out. I don't know if you saw this study that said, they asked people to what extent they thought their neighbors were morally good or morally bad. And in Canada, 7% of Canadians think their neighbors are morally bad. In the UK, 17% of folks there think their neighbors are morally bad. In the US, 53% of people think their neighbors are morally bad. That isn't really encouraging for the future of American democracy. And for those of us who are invested, for all the many deep flaws, and we can talk about those for hours, right? Of this society, past, present, and even looking ahead. If you want pluralistic democracy to continue to flourish, like, we got to find a way to sustain a society with people that we have deep disagreements with. And we're not doing awesome at that right now. And I think labels like this that drive up, I think, a sense of the kind of othering of a huge group of people. And I mean, even by the sort of scholarly, a lot of the scholar stuff, they'll say it's 30, 40% that kind of score high on Christian nationalism. Black Christians score really high on Christian nationalism in those studies. Latino Christians score high on Christian nationalism in those studies. We're painting with such a broad brush, in my view, that it's really hard to figure out, like, how are we going to address the fact that 53% of us think our neighbors are morally bad? It's not going to come through lobbing terms at them. It's going to come through engagement, through taking people seriously. Part of what that doesn't mean for me is like pretending like we don't disagree. There's a way to have important conversations with people where you treat people with respect and you take them seriously and you say, you know what? I love you. I care about you. And I think you're dead wrong about this. And I'm going to tell you that because I love you. You know what I mean? And that is possible to do. We shouldn't give up on that as an important, like, vein of engagement that I worry sometimes people left of center are giving up on that vein of engagement and see any kind of engagement with folks who voted for Trump in 2024 as like, that's just a kind of accommodation or a kind of compromise. And for me, it's like, no, like, let's tell the truth, but let's do it in a way that just treats people with basic respect and tells the truth and makes the case for why we think we've got a better road forward, you know? And I still believe in that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a part of it is also going back to that Pew study, and I talked to someone recently about that, and I think it's seeing that other person, and we don't really know who they are. And you talked a little bit about Zoran Mandami, and I think he's kind of a person that I don't always agree with on politically, but he has that thing that, to use the word from Tim Keller, is winsome. And so he's able to just reach out to people. I think that's why he was popular, and that's why he's now the mayor, is that there is a certain amount of curiosity that he had and wanted to reach out to people. And I think we have to be willing to be curious to people, and especially to people that we don't agree with. You know, why do you believe what you believe? What led you to vote the way you do? Not in an accusatory way, but just to find out more where are you coming from?
Yep. Yeah, and that, I mean, whatever you think about Mamdani's politics, like, that's what he did so beautifully. I mean, he's, you know, I remember he was out at the polls on the primary election day, like, giving Cuomo folks hugs, and it's like, because for him, it's like there's a way to be a human being, even in politics, where you convey a regard for people that doesn't stop when they vote the way they vote one year, and that imagines, you know, and this is my own story. This is so many people's stories. You know, people are on a journey, and if you think that they're static, you're wrong. And the way you engage somebody else who's on a journey is going to impact that journey. And, you know, it's tough these days in our social media landscape and all whatnot to really get deep into somebody and for someone to change their mind. I think it's tough, but when it happens, it's because someone took them seriously, someone that they loved and cared about, saw the things differently, and loved them enough to, like, hang in relationship with them. That's powerful. There's real power in that. And I think, again, on the left of center side of the aisle, like, we need to cultivate the ability to hang in with people, even when we think they're wrong, recognizing, hey, you know what? We're going to be wrong on some things too. God's not done with me yet. And got to hold out hope for transformation.
Well, if people want to know a little bit more about you or maybe contact you, how can you do that?
I've got a website, heathwcarter.com, that's got links to a lot of my work and my emails on there and whatnot. I do a lot of speaking and happy to hear from folks and happy to continue this conversation.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. This was, I think, enlightening. I do think also hopeful, because I think sometimes this whole discussion on Christian nationalism can be kind of depressing and frustrating. And I think this is maybe a way out of that bind that we've been in.
Well, thanks for the great questions. Great. Really enjoyed talking with you.
All right. I know that you probably have thoughts about this, and I'd love to hear them. If you want, you can share an email to me, send an email to me at churchandmain@substack.com. I will include a link to Heath's article. I think it's a really good one. You will want to read it kind of for a little bit more talk about the role of Christian nationalism, and really kind of an expanded role, because I think, as you could tell in the discussion and in the article, continues that what we think of Christian nationalism is actually an expansive view of it. So I'd love to hear your views. Now, if you want to know more about this podcast, if you want to listen to past episodes or donate, you can go to churchandmain.org. You can also go to churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles. I also do post some of these episodes on Substack, so just be on the lookout for them. And there you can also subscribe if you'd like. That is for $5 a month, $60 a year. You don't have to, but if you are able to, I would be incredibly thankful for that. There's also a link in the show notes if you want to make sure to get this podcast in your inbox. Just click on that link and we'll have that done. I also hope that you will consider rating or reviewing this podcast. When you do that, that actually helps others find the podcast. And if you can, also consider passing this podcast along to a friend who might want to know more about it. You can also check us out. We do have a page on Facebook, so check that out. It should be under Church and Main Podcast. So that is it for this episode of Church and Main. As I always like to say, thank you so much for listening. It really does mean a lot that you guys listen. And Godspeed, everyone, and I will see you very soon.